All right, good afternoon on my time and good morning on your time. I am here with Erica Mongé-Greer, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. Erica is an adjunct professor who teaches courses in Hebrew Bible, ancient Near Eastern culture, and Semitic languages like Hebrew and Akkadian. Her most recent faculty postings were at Northwest Christian University and the University of Oregon in Eugene, where she lives with her partner Joshua, and their two children, Caleb and Emma, and adopted dog Zuzu. Erica's research includes justice for the poor in the Hebrew Psalter, or the Psalms for my students, biblical ethics, and religion in science fiction. And she is here with us today to lend her expertise on the topic of creation mythologies. In a minute, I'll start asking her a few questions, but I'll clarify for my students that you often hear the word myth in the present, and automatically you think that just means something to discard or something that is inherently false and anti-scientific, and that's not really how academics tend to use the word mythologies. They tend to use the word mythologies mostly for stories that have a meaning, that try to interpret the world around us. But these are ancient mythologies from cultures that have long been bygone era. So we are digging back into the past because that's where most of the biblical material originates, and we are going to learn about the context that shaped the Bible. So the first question I'll ask you, Erica, is tell us about your professional training and what it is that you research and teach, other than the brief bio that I just gave.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks for having me. Primarily, I study the Hebrew Bible, or also called the Old Testament. My scholarship and my interests have primarily centered on the language, the literature, and the culture of not only Hebrew text, but also textual affiliations in the ancient Near East. My focus has been primarily on literature from the Levant region, which is like Syria and Palestine and where Israel is located, and in ancient Mesopotamia, which is to the east where Babylon was in the ancient world. My PhD work focuses more specifically on ethics, and especially on mythical language in the Psalms, like divine counsel and the names that are used for God that cross over into other mythologies from the ancient Near East. I'm specifically working on divine counsel and ethics in Psalm 82, which is widely considered a mythological text. As part of my thesis, I also worked with comparisons in Ugaritic text to Hebrew text, which is a similar language and literature group, considered second millennium texts from the northern Levant. And I've also studied other texts in Semitic languages, like Aramaic, Akkadian, and other West Semitic regions. So that's where I've run across the creation epic material.
Yeah, I was just saying before we got to recording that the benefit for my students here is they're going to hear from someone where this is more their area of expertise. So students, my main focus tend to be the Christian Gospels, and that's where my research is. And I know about this stuff, but Erica, this is her area of expertise. So we're very grateful that you've taken the time to do this interview. So let's jump into some of the questions that my students will be listening for your answers. This week, my students will have juxtaposed the first and second creation narratives of the book of Genesis. So they've seen how these stories, while stitched together, are still different. In the context of the ancient Near East, how are these Israelite/Judahite accounts unique?
Great. So I'm going to back this up a little bit and talk about the context of the stories that explain the beginning of the world and life as we know it. They are common to all cultures and across time. So there are two basic categories of creation narratives: cosmogony, or origins of the world, and anthropogeny, the origins of humankind. And both of those are in the Genesis, the first two narratives of creation in Genesis that you've studied. Basically, these cosmogony and anthropogeny are fancy academic words for stories that explain people's worldview, or how they understand the cosmos and how they understand their place as humans in the order of that cosmos. So for a modern day example of cosmogony, you could turn to Dr. Neil deGrasse Tyson's documentary called Cosmos: A Space-Time Odyssey, in which Dr. Tyson relies on a modern understanding of science and nature to tell the story of the world's beginnings and the beginnings of human existence. While the purpose and approach of cosmogonies from the ancient world and the modern world may be similar, the stories were very, very different. Ancient cosmogonies included the actions and priorities of divine entities or gods, while modern cosmogonies typically rely on modern scientific method. So the Hebrew Bible presents us with a unique cosmogony, but the form and nature of the text draws on various traditions clearly situated in an ancient Near Eastern cultural context among other cosmogony stories. In the first creation account, Genesis 1:1 through 2:3, all things begin with darkness and water. Creation from a watery beginning is a common theme in ancient Near Eastern origin stories. In fact, the recreation of the world after the flood, which we're going to talk about later, begins again with a watery chaos in Genesis 8:1 through 5, where God also brings everything back to an original watery form before creating and begins anew. So in Genesis 1, the wind or spirit of God hovers over the water before creation in existence. But then we also see in Genesis 8 where God breathes a wind or spirit over the land so that the waters divide, and then we have another form of creation. So even within the biblical context, we see this common theme of a watery beginning. But we'll also see it in other ancient Near Eastern texts from Babylon. The two creation narratives in Genesis mirror each other. In fact, at the end of both texts, the living humans are instructed, the two creation narratives in Genesis 1 and 8 mirror each other in that way. At the end of both texts, the living humans are instructed to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so we definitely have a sense of Genesis 1 and Genesis 8 being one kind of creation narrative in the ancient Near East. God, the name used for God is unique in these stories. So in Genesis 1, God is called Elohim in the Hebrew. That's the Hebrew word used that's translated as God in your English Bible, which is one of the names for God in the Bible. But it's also a broad term for divine beings in the ancient Near East. So it's a bit of an ambiguous term for the name of God. Elohim is the epithet that appears in Genesis 1. So in the very first verse, when you read, when in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, you're reading Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And then in Genesis 8, we also see Elohim is used for that. Elohim creates all living things, and Elohim also creates the container for all living things, which is called in Genesis 1 the firmament and the land, and the firmament being the thing that holds up the sky, which is probably invisible to us, and also creates its maintenance, which is the light and the dark. God creates the thing that regulates the maintenance of the firmament and the land. So many scholars believe that the order of creation is significant in Genesis 1, that first comes the light, followed by the plants, which depend on the light, followed by animals, which need plants to survive. And the pinnacle of all creation then is humankind, which comes at the very end and is charged with taking ownership of all the plants and the animals. Then God is satisfied and retires. The deity or God described in Genesis 1 is distant and powerful. Everything is well ordered and placed. Some scholars believe that Genesis 1 reflects a priestly perspective, with God ordering the world before resting and then taking a Sabbath on the seventh day. 7 is a significant number in the ancient world. It is also significant in Babylonian writings. And the fact that this creation narrative is based on a 7-phase creation suggests that the author is drawing on a clear understanding of ancient Near Eastern ideas about time and the significance of a 7-phase cycle. The Babylonian Genesis, the Enuma Elish, which we'll talk about in more detail in a minute, was written on 7 tablets. There are thought to have been 7 known planets by ancient scholars in Babylon as well. And the 7th day of the month is a significant day in several ancient Near Eastern texts, not only in the Hebrew Bible, but also in Babylonian narratives as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks. And I can talk about the second account. So in the second account, Genesis 2:4 through 2:25, The ambiguous term for gods, Elohim, is then modified with a proper name. So this is where we get the name of God, which God has revealed to Moses in the future of the Hebrew Bible text, which is usually pronounced in English as Yahweh, Elohim. So we have a specific God in this creation account. And this creation account then is more specific because of this. In this account, God is keeper of a garden. This creation begins with arid land as opposed to the watery chaos like was in Genesis 1 and 8. Genesis 2's God is like an artist who begins forming clay into a human form and breathing divine breath into that likeness so that it comes to life from the ground. The earth feels like a complementary entity in this passage. The earth is the womb from which life springs in response to the breath or spirit of Yahweh God. The Hebrew language speaks to that order. From the Adamah, which is the word for earth, God creates Adam, or an earth being. First, there's humankind, which is the opposite of the first narrative. I'm sure you've read. Then the trees and plants, followed by rivers of waters. And the idea of the clay image coming to life after receiving the breath of the deity is not unique in the ancient Near East. The Assyrian priests also were known to facilitate the creation of household gods by taking a clay form and breathing, allowing the deity to breathe into that form through a washing of the mouth ceremony, which was a common practice in the ancient Near East, which is referenced in Jeremiah 10. Genesis 2 draws upon an understanding of this ancient Near Eastern tradition to explain how humankind can be made in the image of God and also contain God's spirit within that image. So in the Hebrew account, the creation of earth and the creation of humans, those words we use, cosmogony and anthropogeny, are mingled. In Assyrian literature, they appear as separate events in the storyline. In the myth of Atrahasis, for example, the gods get tired of doing all the grunt work and caring for everything, so they petition to have a lesser being. There's a midwife involved, or a birth goddess, who creates a human being from a mixture of clay and blood of a great god who's sacrificed. The goddess ensures then that a woman and man mature and then are able to reproduce. And then this kind of will take us into the flood narratives that we'll talk about later.
Yeah, that's excellent. And wonderful to see how the two narratives have parallels in other literature, and we'll definitely be getting into some of the flood material in a second interview that our students will make sure they get to watch when they study the flood mythologies as well. So very, very good information, especially that part about how the Assyrian priest had this ritual where the image of the god is receiving a breath, and that's not something that when we talk about the book of Genesis that I bring out. So it's excellent that you bring that, because I didn't have an awareness of that particular ritual, and that really does bring to life how the humans, if I'm understanding this correctly, the humans themselves are being kind of, we might call mini idols, right? Like they're receiving the divine breath. So that's fascinating.
I think that's the significance of putting that in the Genesis account, of saying that these humans were created in the form of the God. They're like living idols of the God that are walking around doing God's work on the earth.
Right. That's excellent. It helps us better understand a little bit of at least for the authors of these texts, from the Jewish perspective, why images of God seem to be unnecessary when you already have biological images of God present in front of you.
Yeah, absolutely.
So my students will be reading excerpts from the Enuma Elish. Can you provide us with a basic overview of this creation account?
Yeah, absolutely. The Enuma Elish, which is also called the Babylonian Genesis, is probably the most well-known Genesis account beside the Hebrew Genesis. The Enuma Elish tablets were excavated in sites dated to about 1200 BCE. However, there's a consensus that they were copied from an older tradition that may go back even before the fall of Sumer, which brings it back into early second millennium, possibly even third millennium, which is quite a bit earlier than we have any evidence of Hebrew language. So significant story as a background to the Hebrew text. The opening lines of the Enuma Elish refer to bricklaying and clay structures, which reminds some scholars of Genesis 11, where the earth's population come together to build the Tower of Babel, for example. But the main story of the Enuma Elish describes a scene where the cosmos consists of many deities and no humans. The most powerful deity is named Tiamat. She is a woman. She represents the ocean and is represented often by like a sea dragon and some other descriptions. She is confronted in the story by all the gods who are her children, who rise up against her for some reason. So she raises an army and chooses a leader named Kingu, who becomes kind of significant later on in the creation of humans. There is one god named Anu who tries to go up against her. He can't, and he gives this report back to his father, which I think is interesting and also very misogynistic. He says, a woman's strength may be very great, but it cannot match a man's, even though he couldn't defeat her. Then another god who is important also later in the flood narratives, named Ea, calls for his son Marduk. And Marduk is the protagonist, the main character in this story. And he charges Marduk to lead the battle now against Tiamat. Marduk wins and becomes the champion. He is called the most important among the great gods. Tiamat is thought to have been represented by, like I said, by a great sea dragon, which comes into effect when Marduk creates the world. So Marduk splits her corpse, her long corpse, in half, and uses one piece to create the heavens, which would be like the firmament that God creates in Genesis 1. And this firmament, like the Genesis firmament, holds back the waters of the sky, so like the rain, and keeps from flooding from happening, etc. So with her entrails, Marduk creates other things like the constellations, which he forms in the likeness of the gods. So we have evidence of early kind of astrology happening possibly in Babylon. He creates the moon to mark months and days of significance, which are 7 and 15 in this narrative. He uses her head and body parts to create rivers and springs and mountains. And so the whole earth is made up of Tiamat. She bursts the earth through her death, essentially. The lower half of her carcass makes up the earth. So there also is this bipart earth, just like in the Genesis, the Hebrew Genesis, where we have the firmament above, the land below. But this time it's created from a divine being, not by a divine being, I guess, in that sense. The crowning achievement of Marduk is naming the house of the great gods, which is Babylon. So Babylon becomes the center of the world through this story. And the great king Marduk is its uncontested champion and the god of Babylon. In tablet 6, Marduk decides to create humankind. And so we have the anthropogeny to bear the gods' burden that those may rest. So the gods can only rest after humans are created in the Enuma Elish. So Marduk creates humankind so that the gods can rest. And as punishment for leading Tiamat's army, Kingu, who is the god that she chose to be her champion in the battle, was chosen to sacrifice and make humankind from his blood. So Kingu's blood is mixed with clay, and then we have the birth of humankind from that. And the final tablet, which is tablet 7, lists all of Marduk's names or titles and explains his greatness. So Marduk has many names, like King of all the world and greatest king and leader of all people. I mean, any magnificent name you could think of is given to Marduk.
It's fascinating because as I hear that, and I hope my students are listening to this, you have so many aspects of this narrative that you can make connections with the Hebrew creation story. So you have a 2-part universe, and you have humans created for a purpose, and you have a desire for some kind of rest from the gods. So there's these similarities, and I always think that it's interesting that while it's the slight differences. What is the purpose of the humans? What is the purpose of the rest? What is the nature of the 2 aspects of creation? Those slight differences between the Babylonian and Hebrew accounts seem to make all the difference to me. And that's where I try to tell my students, look at those differences, because that's where the Hebrew narrative is trying to make its mark and trying to say its particular message, right? And so that brings us to maybe a contrast in our deities. We have Marduk that you've mentioned. So my question here is, how is Marduk the patron god of Babylon, who we hear as this king. And obviously I imagine the Babylonian kings look to Marduk as kind of their human divine relationship there. We're the greatest kings of the earth. They're the greatest god of the universe. So how is Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, similar to, but also different from how the Hebrew account presents their god, Yahweh?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Enuma Elish could be thought of as a creation myth with a political agenda. It is a cosmogony that explains how Marduk became the supreme god, ruling from the important city of Babylon. And as we know, the Akkadian language, which came out of Old Babylon and Assyria, was the lingua franca, or the common language for all the land. I mean, at this point, the Hebrews are a very tiny people and never actually get to, even in all of their journey, they never become a powerful political entity in the ancient Near East. So, so their God remains seen as a small and not powerful God by other nations, essentially. So the Marduk, that's probably why the story of the Enuma Elish is more widely spread, in excavations. That Marduk becomes the kind of supreme god over all gods. If you want protection from Babylon, you build a statue of Marduk in your territory politically. So the narrative of the Enuma Elish makes Babylon the first and most important city and describes how Marduk becomes their patron deity. So this is a universe that's ordered with Babylon at its center, and the leaders of Babylon as just as supreme as Marduk, basically. So it's important to understand that this style of writing, of using these kinds of creation myth as a political agenda, because it informs how we interpret the Hebrew creation narrative, which probably came about to explain the importance of Yahweh, God, and the Israelites, right, and the importance that they saw in themselves, especially when you're thinking about, although this gets into another territory, when you're thinking about the fact that parts of the Genesis narrative may have been written or even completed when the Israelites are in exile in Babylon. So right, you have a reason to preserve a story against the Marduk, right, against the Marduk imperative. So what the Hebrew Genesis offers is a cosmogony with a different God, saying Marduk is not the center of the universe, Babylon's not the center of the universe. The Hebrew account represents a creation narrative focusing on a God to whom all creation belongs, not just the God of a city or a people, but there is reason to interpret a Hebrew Genesis as a kind of expansive, God owns everything and God is over everything. And especially when you bring in certain Psalms that also refer to creation and God being the creator of everyone and everything in it. Also, God has a different motivation for creating human beings that we kind of get revealed to us through the story of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew narrative does not merely ask its reader to consider a replacement for Marduk or a replacement for Babylon. Instead, it presents a narrative that allows for a new idea of a God, the Hebrew God, Yahweh Elohim, to claim rulership over all the earth and over all people.
It's fascinating too, because and I definitely try to teach from the approach that at least in the form that we have it, this narrative is definitely in a dialogue with the Babylonian story, which to me is fascinating because you have this defeated group essentially that's saying, actually, we hear your stories and we would like to counter you with this other story. And there's this more universalizing tendency. I don't want to jump too far down the line historically, but there does tend to be, as you're saying, Yahweh is not just the God of this group, Babylon, but everybody, which then seems to relativize Marduk a bit, saying, sure, you have your patron deity, but actually our God, even though you defeated us in warfare, our God is actually still your God. It's the creator God. It's the greatest God. Where on the ground in the ancient world, it seems that there's no evidence for that, right? Like if Yahweh's people are defeated and Yahweh's temple is destroyed, what grounds is there to claim that Yahweh is the greater God? And yet there's the tenacity to go ahead and still make that claim, which I find to be one of the most fascinating things to emerge from the ancient world. And then that Hebrew view of God, I wouldn't say it wins because it definitely will evolve. but it definitely keeps going, where the view of Marduk, especially after the fall of Babylon, to the Persians, it seems that that starts to wane a little bit. So it's fascinating how the defeated group's vision of God continued to evolve over time, whereas the conqueror's vision of God, once they weren't the conqueror anymore, it faded into history for the most part.
Yeah, that's it. It is. I mean, it's miraculous that these are the texts that survived and have influenced nations' rise and fall, and wars and campaigns, and and not the great epic of Gilgamesh or the epic of Atrahasis or Marduk.
Indeed. And this brings us to something else I think that really stands out. We talked a little bit about the kind of compare and contrast. Whenever you see the similarities, look for the slight difference. And one of the things that really stands out to me, you just hinted at a little while ago, is that in the book of Genesis, when we taking both creation narratives into account, how would we summarize the purpose of humanity in the Hebrew creation narratives, and how does that compare with the Enuma Elish?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like that's a question that could be worked on forever through the text, actually. But I think in the creation narratives themselves, in the Akkadian and Sumerian creation myths, which there are a few others that describe, besides the Enuma Elish, that kind of support that description of mixing clay and the blood of a deity. The purpose is so that humans can work and toil on the earth, so that the gods can take a resting time, so that they can relax or play or do whatever. And according to the text, that whatever they want seems to consist of raging parties and massive brawls, all of which include lots of sex and drinking. So it's not like they're doing anything important or purposeful. It's just that they want time off from having to maintain, I guess, the things that the earth needs, like the agriculture and stuff. In the Hebrew accounts, though, humans are created with a similar beginning, with a mixture of clay, but instead of the blood of the god, we have a mixture of the breath of the god. The Genesis narrative doesn't give us an explicit reason, like the Enuma Elish, for why God creates humans. In chapter 1, God speaks for a council, a divine council, says, "Let us create humankind in our image according to our likeness." So there's an implicit kind of need for like fellowship, it seems, with these lesser beings of humankind, whatever, these beings from the earth that God creates. So God expresses that humans are going to do, God still expresses the same as the Enuma Elish, that humans will do the work of maintaining the earth, but the purpose of their creation is different. It's not so that God can go out and party and leave the humans alone. As we read through the text, we find out that God actually wants to have a relationship with creation. And so there is a very different way that the creation narrative sets up, which becomes revealed as we read along the narrative of the Hebrew Bible. It seems that also that the Hebrew account, the Hebrew Genesis, speaks in terms of stewardship, suggesting that humans rule over the earth and the animals, or have kind of a stewardship or a service to the animals and the earth. God instructs the humans to procreate so they can fill the earth and tame the land, which is already filled with food and animals and opportunity, even before the humans arrived in the Genesis 1 account anyway. In chapter 2, we see that God creates humans first, and then places all the necessary vegetation, and creates this whole garden that we call the garden, the Garden of Eden. And the humans then can serve the land. And the word serve is aved, for the Hebrew word for serve is actually used in that account, that you'll have service to the land. So there is this implied stewardship in the Hebrew Genesis. The Babylonian and Hebrew accounts of creation both suggest a divine council of gods preceded the creation of humans, that there's some conversation about how and why humans should be created. The Hebrew account reveals Yahweh God as the sole progenitor and creator of humankind, breathing God's own spirit into the clay form so that it would live with the essence of God, the creator. The Babylonian accounts involve various gods in the decision making and fighting and interruptions and different opinions, and the blood from a sacrifice god is required to mix with the clay. And in the Enuma Elish version, it's the punishment for this evil Kingu who stood up against gods. In another creation narrative from Babylon, there's a chosen old god who is sacrifice, who chooses to sacrifice. So the reason is a little bit obscure depending on which text and when it was written. But in both accounts, the human serves the earth to produce vegetation and must serve the earth for the human's own survival. And so we get a kind of like explanation for why the way things are. And that's very human. There's a very human need for that. And I think the first time I encountered that in my life was Rudyard Kipling, how the elephant got its trunk, and, why things are the way they are. We have a desire to tell that story. And these anthropogonies are telling the story of why do humans have to toil and work the earth in order to live? Why do we want a relationship with the one who created us? And I think that gets into bigger questions of creation ethics, which is another area of exploration, but it's very interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating because once you start to think through how these stories are presenting our purpose as humans, it asks the question of what's the human's responsibility. And this brings my mind back again to what you've talked about as these creation stories having a political, with Marduk being this, and this is not to say that the Hebrew Bible doesn't have a warlike God or its own text about slavery. But here, Marduk is very proudly the warlike god, and then all this comes about. And so we might talk about it as psychological projection. The Babylonians, they are the warlike people that are victorious, and surprise, surprise, their god is this battle worn warrior who defeats everybody. And we know the Babylonians, when maybe not at the same level the Assyrians did, but when they won, you were to owe them your life. And we could even talk about, especially with the Judahite exiles, in some form of being enslaved. You're brought to Babylon, you'll do what we say. And here, when you look at Marduk, what is humanity for? What are the marked in the gods? What is humanity for? Well, you're here. And so there's this justification that Babylon says, hey, our God is the ruler of all humans. Our God is the one who created you all to be slaves, but we're special. We're Babylon. So you got to get that exception clause there for the Babylonians themselves. And that's all fascinating when you think about, again, the political message being proclaimed by the Babylonians, and then the return served by the Judahites when they're comparing their visions of deity.
Yeah, absolutely.
While my students won't be asked to read from the Memphite Theology, it still seems like that would be relevant to this discussion. So what is the Memphite Theology and what story does it tell?
Well, the Memphite Theology is a creation narrative from Egyptian culture. So when you're talking about Israel in the Levant or in the Palestinian region, then you have the people to the east, who's Babylonian and Assyrian, and that's where we get the Enuma Elish and Gilgamesh and all these Sumerian stories. And then we have the people to the west, who are Egypt. And in the Hebrew Bible itself, we read a lot about the political tension between the Assyrians and Babylonians and the Egyptians, and they're kind of pulling for allegiance from the people of Israel at different phases or stages of their political history. So you do have a lot of influence, and of course, famously, the Hebrew people come from Egypt in the Exodus narrative. So Egyptian literature becomes significant to understanding the stories of the Hebrews. The Memphite theology is dated by many scholars to the Ramesses period, so around the time also that the Exodus story is dated. And since the Hebrews became a people who essentially formed out of that people who were slaves in Egypt for hundreds and hundreds of years, the Egyptian culture and worldview becomes essential to understanding the worldview of the early Israelites. And even this becomes the earliest influence and narrative through which we get the Genesis, the Hebrew Genesis. So in the Memphite theology, Ptah is the main character or the main god. He was the local deity in Memphis, Egypt. His temple was very big and prominent there. The Memphite theology describes how the world was and all things were created through his speech and love, through his tongue and heart, the words say. And this is how he creates not only humankind, but also other gods. So the Egyptian narrative has a different kind of basis for the creation of the world, kind of springing out of this body, basically. I guess in some ways it's like Marduk using Tiamat's body to create the world, but it is very different from the Hebrew Genesis. The narrative then describes the origination of the gods through Ptah as a creative analogy, referring to various deities as different parts of a body. So while Ptah represents the tongue and the heart, which command all other things, other deities make up limbs and mouth, the lips and teeth, and even semen or fingers and extremities. The narrative describes divine origins of Egypt and its primeval king Osiris and his son Horus. Other Egyptian cosmogonies include details about the origins of the earth beginning with primeval waters of chaos. So we get that same beginning, and it's no surprise because there's a great river, the Nile, which flooded every year to produce agriculture. And there's, you know, these two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, and then there's the sea, the Red Sea and the Dead Sea, and in Palestine, in the Palestinian region. So water was a commodity and a resource. So it's no surprise that the beginning of creation comes in this watery zone. In these other Egyptian creation stories, we have the sun as a significant source that comes up and dries up the land and leads to the formation of the world. Egyptian cosmogonies vary depending on place of origin. So while the Memphite theology origins in Memphis and has its god as the center, we also see a similar theme of political stories placing in each origin story from Egypt their own god at the center of the universe or the center of creation. So we have a local deity centered as the progenitor of creation in each of these texts. So we have like a text from Hermopolis, Heliopolis, Memphis, and Thebes. The main components of the Egyptian world consisted of a firmament, again, or a sky, or something that holds back the water in the sky, which in Egypt was held up by the goddess Nut, and a lower ground which contained the underworld, which would be like Sheol in the Hebrew Bible, the Abraham's bosom, which is overseen by the deity Geb in Egypt. Various deities were contained by natural surroundings. So the trees had deities in them, or life, water, celestial bodies, and the stars and the moon. This cosmology is not very different from what unfolds in the Hebrew Bible, in the text of Genesis, and especially also in the Psalms, where we read a lot about, you know, Sheol and the deep waters and where God can and can't go. Famously, in some of these passages, we see a very similar like cosmology drawing to the Egyptian cosmos.
It's fascinating to hear things, again, these echoes where we have like speech, and you got to get that Genesis 1, and then you have that Egyptian speech there, bringing things. And when you look at especially the two Hebrew creation accounts, you can kind of say, oh, that sounds a little bit like this and a little bit like that. And that brings me to the final question for our session here on creation mythologies, because I hope that by now my students are hearing that to understand these biblical creation stories in Genesis 1 and 2, you have to recognize that there's an interweaving, an interconnection with the broader culture, whether that's North Africa, the Levant, the Mesopotamia region, and all these stories are kind of intersecting with each other as cultures, trade stories. And so what has become this written text that many people are familiar with now in Genesis 1 and 2, thanks to Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and just its influence on culture. When you look closely at these texts, you cannot get away from the fact that these ancient cultures have contributed, like their seeds of their stories are there. So my question is this ties into what my students are doing and what you do professionally. Why is it important for students of the Bible to understand the ancient Near East or the Levant or North Africa, Israel's neighboring cultures, and comparative creation mythologies? Why care about outside the Bible when you're studying the Bible?
Yeah, it's a great question. One of these questions that goes on, I think, the more you study. I think at the base where I would start is that the Hebrew Bible comes to us today across major gaps of understanding. So it's an ancient text. It's written in a language very different from our own language. It's the story of a small group of people with with little political significance in a land far, far away and a long, long time ago. So the narratives of the Bible are not Western and they're not modern. They are written from an oral tradition that carried significant truths from generation to generation, and then eventually written down and kind of locked into whatever form they were in the date that they were written. The Hebrew Bible was not written in a vacuum by itself alone, without the influences of other people. And the people who told the stories and wrote them were people of integrity who were communicating to a particular audience with a particular known set of values and a particular known worldview. If we want to understand the truths that those authors were trying to convey by whatever degree of revelation that that individuals believe in or that you believe in, then you have to give the author that kind of credibility of integrity. I think you have to say, okay, this author was trying to communicate some truth value, and if I want to understand that truth, I have to put aside my modern prejudices and attempt to see the text in its own setting, in its own context. This is hard because we have so many lenses throughout many hundreds of years to see the Bible through, and not, especially with the Old Testament in a Christian worldview, there is a large temptation to look through the New Testament lens. And when I teach a Old Testament or a Hebrew Bible class in a college setting, especially in a Christian college setting, we spend the first week or so asking kind of how we're looking at the Old Testament through the New Testament, and how can we kind of put that aside or strip that away, not permanently, but just to set it aside so that we can see what is and is not in the world of the people who actually lived in this time when these stories are happening. And taking the time to learn about the linguistic and literary and cultural influences of the ancient Near East basically raises the quality potential for interpreting and understanding the Hebrew Bible. This should be especially important for those who see this text as sacred scripture. As a sacred text, the Hebrew Bible must be approached with humility. Many people have spent lifetimes meditating on these particular specific ancient words for a lot of different reasons. And to study for truth and understanding, it is equally important to account for the world from which that text was birthed.
Excellent answer, and I hope that my students take this to heart and they recognize that part of the reason why we try to look through a variety of lenses in class, but one of those lenses is asking the types of questions historians ask about the text, is because you're, like you said, you're going to import your worldview onto the text. And while there's some space for that, the reader has a role to play. It goes from 2D to 3D, I would say, when you start to understand the broader context that the text is taking shape, the engagement that the narrative is having, even the small things that we might miss that we've talked about in this interview, the political confrontation, the theological debate almost that's in play. These all make the text not completely different from if we read it without these, but it makes it, and again, I think the analogy, if it goes from 2D to 3D, it expands your understanding. And so this has been a great discussion. I find this stuff fascinating. I hope that some of my students continue to go above and beyond just studying what they have to for their homework for this assignment, but then maybe this will give them an appetite for a greater understanding of how the ancient world works, how ancient cultures work, and how the Bible relates to all that. So thank you so much for taking some time today. And I look forward to our next interview, where we now shift over to flood mythologies, which we'll have available in the next homework assignment for my students. So thank you so much. And we'll talk about flood mythology soon.
Thank you for having me.
All right.